saw it live on Sky News.
Trying to protect these properties
through bush that hasn't been backburnt.
Breaking news.
3 major fires
Burning embers.
The wind is so strong.
Bush between Dudley and Redhead.
Every time they try and douse these flames,
If it misses all the back of the houses,
we're actually receiving some of the water on us now.
some of the other houses
Extremely strong wind.
see flames now.
When you need to know what's happening.
We're up for a 2-day firefight.
The latest pictures.
Right now, we are expecting rely on the unrivaled coverage of Sky News.
$500 billion.
Dozens of fires whipped up across the state.
The wind is so strong.
This is unparalleled.
Firefighters got the upper hand.
Delivering unrivaled live coverage. This is Sky News, Australia's news channel.
Good evening, welcome to the program. There's been a lot of talk over the last few years from the Coalition about a budget crisis, a budget emergency, the need to rein in debt and cut the waste. But this week, now in government, we saw the Coalition raise the debt ceiling by nearly 2/3. And also today move to scrap a tax that is raising some revenue, the mining tax, albeit there's not as much as it was supposed to initially. Still, there was an important step this week on the path to returning our nation's balance sheet to the black. A commission of audit, again promised by Tony Abbott, was announced, was set up with a broad-ranging terms of reference to go through line by line areas of waste in the budget and find some savings. The true test, though, will be, will the government be brave enough to accept, to adopt the recommendations from this commission? Tonight, to look at all of this and more, we're joined by the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer, Steve Ciobo, Richard Dennis, the Executive Director of the Australia Institute, Jennifer Hewett is the National Affairs columnist with the Australian Financial Review, and the Shadow Immigration Minister, Richard Marles. Welcome to you all. I want to start on the mining tax. Today's announcement the draft legislation released today to scrap the tax. It was promised by the Coalition. Steve Ciobo, it is, for its faults, still collecting money, $4.4 billion over the coming 4 years it's meant to collect. If there is a budget crisis, why are you giving up that money?
Well, I think it's important to realise that you've got to look at it in aggregate terms, David, and the reality is that Labor's mineral resource rent tax was a complete failure and flop from the start. It was a tax that wasn't raising adequate revenue. In net terms, it actually was costing Australians money. Secondly, it increased our sovereign risk profile significantly so that we know there are a lot of countries and companies that had second thoughts about investing in Australia.
Such as?
Well, I mean, we know for a fact, for example, that there were a number of large major mining projects that actually said as a consequence of the mining resource rent tax and other factors that they would not go ahead with projects in Australia.
Which ones were those?
Well, I mean, you're asking me to think of one off the top of my head. The reality is that there were a number of comments that were made. We're talking about a debate that took place 12 months ago, so please forgive me if I can't think of one company straight off the top of my head.
Is there any evidence that the mining tax cost investment in Australia?
That's what I just said to you. Absolutely. There was commentary at the time. No, but
is there a decision by a company, a mining company, not to invest because of the mining tax?
That was a factor that was raised together with other factors, that's correct.
By which company?
And it had, I've just answered that to you.
Well, no, you haven't. By which company?
Well, as I'm saying, this was a debate that took place about 12 months ago, and so I can't immediately recall the name of the company off the top of my head, but I'm very happy to go back through media clippings from the time and find, and it wasn't just one company, find other companies that made comments like that. Okay. But to go back to the point that I was making, David, despite sort of wanting to know exactly which one company made a comment 12 months ago or thereabouts, the key point I made was this, that you've got a tax that in aggregate terms is actually costing money.
But why do you have to look at it in aggregate terms? Because the point you're making is Labor committed too much spending when there wasn't enough revenue coming from this
on the
mining.
original iteration of the tax, Labor said it would raise $26 billion over 5 years. Labor committed to spending $17 billion off a consequence of the mining tax, and it's raised thus far $324 million.
But so you are now in government. So what you can do is you can say we're not going to spend all that money on school kids' bonuses and whatnot, but we'll keep the money that's coming in the door because the budget's in crisis. Why can't you do that?
Well, because that's not the kind of big taxing government we want to be. We're a government that's committed to reducing red tape. We're a government that's committed to reducing red tape, and we'll do that by abolishing the mineral resource rent tax. We're a government that's committed to getting our spending under control, and we'll do that by abolishing and taking hard decisions, by abolishing the $17 billion of expenditure associated with the mining resource rent tax. So, you know, we know that there's a lot of work to be done to repair the mess that Labor left behind. But that notwithstanding, we don't want to do it at the expense of our sovereign risk profile and about driving investment, which ultimately drives jobs here in Australia.
The Greens say they won't support it. So what about Labor, Richard Marles? Will you stand in the way of repealing this tax?
Well, this will be a matter that we'll consider, obviously, at the Shadow Cabinet and ultimately the caucus. But
what will you say as part of that meeting?
Oh, well, I think I'll leave my comments in that meeting to that meeting. But let me say this right now. This is, I think, bloody-mindedness on the part of the government. Today is actually a very bad day for small business because as part of this draft legislation, we see the loss carryback being removed. We see the instant asset write-off being removed.
All unfunded spending areas.
Well, I don't think that's fair. They form part they form part of the budget that was brought down this year, and you can see how they were paid for.
Well, how they were meant to be paid for, and there wasn't the money there to pay for them.
Well, so the MART is obviously a profits-based tax. It will raise money when there is good profits.
And this is the problem. It's a very variable income stream, but your spending is already dedicated.
Yes, but the spending that was put into the budget, everyone could see where it was coming from. But let's be clear about what we see today. Today, as part of this draft legislation, those go. The low-income superannuation contribution, that goes. The deferral in the superannuation payments, that happens. So this is a bad day for all those reasons.
You'll vote against it if it's
a bad day for all those reasons. But on the other hand, this is good public policy. It's a much more efficient tax. It's not a consumption-based tax as royalties are. This is a profits-based tax which will make money when there are super profits.
But you're still unsure what you'll do on this?
Well, all I'm trying to preserve now in this conversation is the right of the caucus and the shadow ministry to have its debate and its decision. But I'm absolutely telling you what I think in terms of of what's happening today. And this is bloody mindedness on the part of the government. And on the one hand, they will tell us this is an enormous burden for mining companies, and on the other, they'll say, but it's not raising any money. So you can't have it both ways.
No, but that's
Jennifer Hewett, what do you think of this tax, the iterations that it's been through and where we're at with it now?
Well, the various iterations, I think there is no doubting the fact that the mining tax has been an absolute fiasco from start to finish. It certainly didn't raise and will not raise the amount of money that the Labor government promised it would. At the same time, it has also been responsible for affecting our sovereign risk profile. Sure, people don't say it was just that tax in particular, but in fact it's quite hard now to get projects up in mining in iron ore.
Is this to blame?
This is one of the factors that is to blame. I do think there's no doubt at all that companies are looking around the world and they're deciding where to invest. And if you've got different taxes that are kind of burdensome, and it's true that it doesn't raise much money, but let me tell you, it is incredibly difficult to administer and costly for companies to administer, even if it doesn't raise much money. In terms of it being a profits-based price tax, in fact, the iron ore price at the moment is pretty high. It's much higher than anybody thought, but it is still not raising much money, and that's because it was incredibly badly designed.
This is with the deductions and also the refunding of state mining royalties.
It was basically written by BHP Billiton, and Julia Gillard at the time was totally panicked about how to get herself out of the mess, so they did it, and BHP Billiton wrote it in a way that was meant that the companies that were established, as opposed to the new miners who are hoping to get established, who had to borrow rather than rely on their own cash flow, were the ones that would be protected for years to come. So
Richard Dennis, I'm keen for your thoughts as an economist on this tax. Is it a good tax or a bad tax?
Oh, look, it's a better than nothing tax. It was poorly designed and poorly implemented. The original RSPT would have raised a lot more revenue, and as Jennifer said, I mean, this was written by BHP and Rio Tinto.
I think the RSPT was actually even worse designed.
Well, we'll never know, but in a nutshell, this was legislation that was very heavily influenced by the mining companies who were not paying it. And look, I'll go shag on a rock here. I think the best thing to do would be to broaden it. There's no reason that gold isn't included in this tax. There's no reason that copper isn't included in these tax. These are important natural resources of Australia. We could be collecting a lot of money from companies at a point in the cycle where they're doing well, and whether you put that in a sovereign wealth fund, whether you use that to lower the company tax rate, whether you use that to to invest in infrastructure.
Or whether you don't have the investment at all because people are putting
No, it's a profits-based tax. There is a queue.
We collect a lot of money from those companies already, don't we?
Well,
we collect hundreds of millions of dollars of tax.
And well, we should.
From those companies already.
And they make billions of dollars in profit. The point is that there aren't many economists you'll find that think that a country shouldn't have a well-designed super profits tax, a resource rent tax that says at a point in the world commodity cycle where prices go through the roof, the people who actually own those resources should be a major beneficiary. And there are similar taxes in Mongolia. There's plenty of investment in Mongolia. There are similar taxes all around the world and plenty of investment around the world. So look, it's revenue that if we don't collect it at a point in time when commodity prices are at a very high level, we'll have to collect from some other base.
Do you accept, Richard Marles, though, that as with the carbon tax, Tony Abbott has a mandate to get rid of these things?
Well, I think there's a whole discussion we can have about mandate.
All right, what do you think he's got a mandate for?
Well, I think actually at the end of the day that's a matter for him to articulate, but people voted for the Labor Party.
You're the guys deciding in the Parliament yes or no to the things that he took to the election, right? So what do you think he's got a mandate for?
What we're deciding upon is the way in which we exercise our vote based on those who voted us into the Parliament.
Yes, and do you accept there's a mandate for anything?
I think mandate is an important question, but there is a mandate for oppositions as well. I mean, we were elected into the Parliament, and people who voted for us expect us to behave in a particular way. So I think there is a debate. I think there is a debate about mandate, and I think it's a legitimate debate.
So what's your answer to it then? What mandate? You won a third of the electorate's votes. Labor won a third. What does Tony Abbott have a mandate for?
Well, I think I'm not going to go into that. I think but I suppose the way I'd answer that question is this. I think for us in opposition, it is important to think through the questions of mandate and where that will ultimately lead us to is being judicious in the battles in which we fight.
And is that part of the thinking on this question of the mining tax, whether there is a mandate for this?
Well, I think it is part of it, but there's a whole lot of... But part of the thinking is also just what is good policy and what is not, and what is our mandate in this in terms of people voting for Labor and those of us being in the Parliament representing those who voted for us. So, sure, it is part of it, but at the end of the day, you can't avoid the policy here as well, and what we have is a good tax, one which is based on profit, one which is not based on consumption. And if you look at the petroleum resource rent tax, it was a long time before it made money as well for the government, and yet it's a very important part.
And it's being kept in place.
It's a very different tax in a very different industry.
It's quite funny that you would say that this is a good tax. I mean, seriously, this is a tax that was meant to raise $26 billion. You attach $17 billion of expenditure to it, and it's so far raised $324 million. You've increased sovereign risk profile. You've put a huge amount of red tape on business, and you say this is a good tax. I mean,
well, it's a good tax because it's
a good tax from Labor Party perspective.
You're only paying it when you're making a lot of money. You're only paying it when you make a lot of money.
But hang on. I'm just hearing that, these companies are making billions of dollars of profits. They're meant to be paying all this money, but yet the revenue's not there.
Well,
I mean, everything you are funding from this, tax
what is being
sitting out there is on borrowed money. It's being spent by borrowed money.
Those items that I've just articulated are funded out of the budget, and you can see where they are paid for.
I think
with borrowed money, that's where it's being paid for.
I think it's very clear that the Labor Party doesn't accept any idea of mandate. I mean, I think that's incredibly clear, that of the government's mandate. And in the end, it'll mean that they'll be fighting as hard as they can until June, and when there'll be a whole different opposition. I think it's kind of convenient for the Labor Party to kind of go down on principle now, knowing these taxes will be abolished later.
Well, what I've said is that that mandate is a legitimate discussion to have, but we're going to have it, and it's not going to happen here in this debate now. But that's
I don't think any of the signals suggest that you accept that the government as a mandate.
All right, we'll take a quick break because I do want to discuss the efforts the government has made this week to deal with the long-term challenges in the budget. The Commission of Audit that was announced, does it have a wide enough scope? Does it have enough time to do this important work? Stay with us.
There's no better bet than a sporting bet, especially on Sporting Bet Cox Plate Day this Saturday. If your first bet of the day isn't a winner, Sporting Bet will give you your money back. That's right, you get an extra chance to back a winner on Sporting Bet Cox Plate Day with Sporting Bet's amazing money back offer. So download the Sporting Bet app and get your money back if your first bet doesn't win at Moonee Valley on Sporting Bet Cox Plate Day. Just another reason why there's no better bet than a sporting bet.
Whether it's a night out with the girls, you're going to the races, or you just want to look absolutely beautiful at the office, at Target we have got something for you, with a range of styles designed to flatter all body shapes. Whether it's about the drape of the material, the pleats that go into the skirt here, and this fit and flare style, the key is to keep it simple. Remember, you have got to be the star of your outfit.
Get more, pay less at Target.
Target?
Target!
Gavin? Oh. Have you been up all night?
I'm looking for hotel deals. 30% discount with breakfast. It's 20% discount with the spa. 40%!
Why didn't you just go to Hotels Combined?
Hotels Combined! Hotels Combined. Hotels Combined.
Compare hundreds of travel sites in seconds at Hotels Combined.
Hotels Combined!
You'd be crazy not to.
Your financial goals are as unique as you are. That's why Colonial First State's range of super and investment options are designed to help you reach them. Because even though your journey may change along the way, you should never lose sight of where you're headed. Talk to your financial advisor about how Colonial First State Super and Investment Solutions can help you find your future.
Welcome to Crown. We open our doors to 25 million visitors every year, making Crown's Melbourne and Perth resorts among our country's most visited tourist destinations. We contribute over $2 billion a year to the Australian economy. And when you're the best, you attract the best. Over 14,400 people who come to work with us. And we train them to be even better in our $10 million training facility. We've already graduated over 4,300 apprentices and trainees. And we're not just investing in our people. Crown's investing over $2.7 billion, upgrading and opening new attractions like restaurants, spas, shops, function areas, conference facilities, theatres, and our 2,800 hotel rooms. Welcome to Crown.
Welcome back to the program. We're talking tonight to Steve Ciobo, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer. We have Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute, Jennifer Hewett from the Australian Financial Review, and the Shadow Immigration Minister, Richard Marles. The Commission of Audit, promised prior to the election, announced this week by the government. Jennifer Hewett, it does look like a fairly impressive lineup of people who are going to be involved, but not much time to do their work. Their first report's due at the end of January. Is it enough time to go through the whole budget?
Well, I think it's tough, but I also think it's a good idea to make it, as quick as possible, really. And I do think that there's also been a lot of work done. I mean, for example, the Business Council of Australia did a very, very comprehensive report, and it wasn't just about, lobbying for lower taxes for business. It was about how to make the economy more efficient, as well as protecting, people, employees, and having a decent social safety net.
Is the head of the Business Council the right person to lead this?
Well, he's retiring as the head of the Business Council in about 6 months. But yes, I actually think so, given the level of work he's done and the amount of understanding he has about all those things, buttressed by other people, about the levels of government and the idea of trying to make the economy as efficient as possible.
Is there anything wrong with Tony Shepherd doing this work, Richard?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the tax system is there for a nation to collect the resources, to collect the tax it needs to fund the services it wants. We don't collect tax because it's fun. We collect tax to fund health, education, infrastructure.
But you don't think he understands understands that?
Well, why would you ask the head of a business group how much tax we should collect? Why would you ask the head of a business group whether business or consumers through the GST
Well, maybe the
should
aim
pay
is to
tax?
improve overall productivity in the economy.
Oh, look, I'm all for that, and I think any good policy process would consult widely, but this isn't consulting widely. This is very much giving a head start to one group who very clearly think that they should pay less tax and that consumers should pay more. But coming back to the question of mandate, I mean, before the election, Tony Abbott was quite clear about some of the things he wouldn't do. Now he's saying that this group can maybe advise him otherwise. So,
well, he's not just acting on his own. Richard Marles, does Labor have any problem with the lineup of people involved here?
Yeah, we do, and I think Richard put it well. It's not that you wouldn't get input from the Business Council of Australia, but it's just a narrow cast in terms of the advice you're receiving. There's no one from small business, for example, in this process. There are no one representing community organisations or welfare groups in this lineup.
But see, the contrary view is that Labor never did this. Instead, you just took advice from the bureaucrats in Treasury.
Oh, well, firstly, I don't think that's right. I think we took advice across the board. But if you're going to do this exercise and you are going to go beyond the government, I mean, firstly, you can't contract out the work of the government, and even the person who is running the secretariat of this is in the BCA, which is extraordinary. But if you're going to consult, you've got to consult widely. And as Richard quite rightly points out, our taxation system is not simply owned by business.
So there should be who should be in there? Some union representative?
Well, I think actually it is about having welfare groups, people who are going to be the beneficiaries of health services, of education services. I think small business is very important. Maybe you have someone from the unions, but there's a whole range of people who could be consulted beyond the narrow cast of business.
What's wrong with that? What's wrong with broadening this out?
Well, you know, it's interesting. The Business Council of Australia, I think, is one, highly regarded. Two, has been fiercely bipartisan. I mean, the BCA has had their position and their fights with both Liberal and Labor governments now for a long time.
What have they had their fights with you over?
Well, I mean, David, the reality is that they have got a strong track record of being fierce advocates for example, productivity reforms, for taxation reform.
Increasing the GST?
Well, I mean, the point is that there is a long track record as a peak body for the major employer groups in this country to stand up to governments of both political persuasions. Now, to have someone like Tony Shepherd go in as the chairman of the Commission of Audit, coupled with the other members that are on the committee, including, for example, Amanda Vanstone, who has a wealth of experience when it comes to social services, is providing a grouping that is going to be able to look at the remit of government, look at that spread between local, state and federal government, that has government experience at a state government and federal government level.
Sure, but just getting to the crux of this, is there anything Tony Shepherd or Amanda Vanstone have advocated that you disagree with?
I'm sure there is, but I mean, to me, what is the purpose of this group? The purpose of this group is to look at the efficiency and productivity of government, and the purpose of this group is to look at the way in which you have the relationship between the different tiers of government. I mean, I know that Labor would like it to be one big love-in, like we saw with their 2020 summit, and have 500 people coming from all over the country, and everyone can have their 7 minutes of fame, and ultimately result in a report of 220 recommendations, of which I think 2 were followed up by the government. But we're actually a bit more serious.
So pick up more recommendations.
Well, we're much more serious about saying what can we do to boost taxpayers' bang for the buck and to improve and streamline and remove duplication, for example, between different tiers of government.
And I think it's also fairly obvious that this report will be done and will be kind of incorporated in budgets. But in terms of changes or shocks that come before the next election, that will not be the case. I mean, that's clearly not going to be the government's intention. They may flag some changes, but they would take them to the next election.
How do we know that?
I think it's fairly clear that Abbott regards this as absolutely essential for his government, and I think that's going to be pretty obvious.
I don't think that is right, because what we've seen is Joe Hockey saying that this will be reported and made public in the context of the next budget.
That's correct.
We've seen some reports saying that they will build in the measures of this into the back end of the forward estimates.
Yes, that's called the back end of the forward estimates is after the next election.
Yes, but the moment you put it in the forward estimates, you've begun the process of implementation. I mean, what the forward estimates do is create space space in the budget going forward. If you didn't put that in the forward estimates, you could be creating the space for something else.
Also,
so the idea that putting something in the forward estimates now does not involve implementation and doesn't require a mandate is absolutely ridiculous.
But why would we be in such a rush? I mean, if we're going to do this in 3 months' time and we're not going to change anything until after the next election.
I think it's a reasonable idea to have a focused approach and it's not going to be within 3 months. It'll take a little bit longer than that. But I think it is important in the first budget to have a clue of where you're going as a long-term, medium-term prospect. And I think that's a reasonable approach.
But it means that by the time we get to the election, we'll be 3 years into what the forward estimates are now, and there will be a whole lot that is contingent upon whether or not those things occur. So we won't be contesting the next election where this is seen as an isolated proposition.
No,
Frankly, David, I think Richard's missing the point. I know you're very exercised about what's going to happen in 3 or 4 years' time, but you're sort of missing the point of this Commission of Audit. It's to deal with the problem that we've got today. It's to deal with the consequences of 6 years of the Labor Party being in government that have dragged us down to now having peak debt expected to reach over $400 billion, to having such large levels of duplication, having a lot of wasted spending. And the focus of this Commission of Audit is to work out how we can change that. Now, there's really two elements to this.
And education
no, we have
now?
made it crystal clear, and this is the scare campaign that Labor loves to run. It's going to mean that suddenly there's going to be cuts to health and education. We have made it crystal clear there will not be.
Well, then why are they part of the Commission?
Because we want everything to be on the table. We want them to look holistically at the approach that government has to look at areas of duplication. There will not be cuts. There may be reassignments in terms of saying we want to spend less money on bureaucracy and more on frontline services, and we make no apologies for that.
You mentioned peak debt because the other announcement made on the same day as this Commission of Audit was lifting the debt ceiling, not to $400 billion as you flagged there, but $500 billion.
No, I said peak debt is now expected to go over $400 billion.
Exactly. I'm not contradicting that, but I'm saying you lifted the debt ceiling not to that amount, but to $500 billion. Why?
Well, because peak debt is forecast to reach over $400 billion.
Because we haven't seen it. It's actually forecast at 370.
You know, I really think that the Labor Party, you ought to be really careful when it comes to forecasting, mate. It was your party in government that said we'd have $1 billion surplus. And then you said, oops, our mistake, it's going to be an $18 billion deficit. And it turned into a $30 billion deficit. So we know based on the government's figures that it was going to be $370 billion.
Treasury figures?
Okay. We now expect that that's going to be over $400 billion.
Is that based on actually see that?
Well, that can go to the Treasurer, but we now expect that to reach over $400 billion. The Australian Office of Financial Management says you need a $40 to $60 billion bit of headroom, and that's the reason why the $500 billion figure exists.
Jennifer,
now, this is Labor's legacy.
Is that fair enough?
I think it's completely fair enough. If you've got the idea that you're getting peak debt going to over $400 billion, and you do need a cushion, $500 billion seems a bit.
Do we need a debt ceiling?
Well, I'm not sure that you do, but
we invented this in 2008, and the history of this is fascinating. We invented the debt ceiling at a time when we were worried about negative net debt. Okay, we were about to be not borrowing.
You mean the coalition surplus?
Let me just explain something.
Negative net debt. I love this.
Let me just explain. Well, this is the point.
The coalition left a large
Listen up.
bundle
You
of
might
money.
learn something. You might learn something. And the money market said this is a travesty. This is terrible. The government's not going to borrow.
You're going to kill the bond market.
You're killing the bond market. So the reason we've invented this legislation for peak debt, there's all this stuff you're hearing about, is the bond market was desperate for us to borrow, even when we didn't need to. So because we started to borrow when we didn't need to, we had to say, well, how much should we borrow then? So we passed a bill that said, right, we'll borrow up to $100 billion just to keep the bond market happy.
But I do think that things have changed, pretty dramatically since that time, and I also think that that's a good idea to have the suggestion for everyone, including the markets, that the government has a limit of what it's going to be prepared to do, and it's trying to go down. And maybe it's psychological, but I don't think it does any harm.
No, I think you create these ridiculous and unnecessary rigidities in the system, and you get the kind of politics around what's happening in the US.
That doesn't signal that there is some level of fiscal prudence, even if it is $500 billion.
No, this is very important. This is gross debt, not net debt. This is gross debt. So imagine you've got $100,000 in the bank, and you've got a $200,000 mortgage. Your net debt's $100,000. This debt ceiling is a gross debt figure, not a net debt figure. The gross debt figure does not tell us about Australia's fiscal position at all. It's about how we're managing, whether we're parking money in this account or that account. So, no, this is a fiction. The only reason we have legislation for a debt ceiling The only reason this exists was because at one point we weren't going to have enough debt, and the money market said, please, 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 could the Commonwealth borrow some money off us?
The other announcement that I'm curious about this week was the not a small amount of money, $8.8 billion being given to the Reserve Bank to give it the buffer, the fat that it might need should the rainy day occur down the track. But it is a lot of money. And what's unclear, Steve Ciobo, is whether it asked for the money this year.
Well, the reality is this, David. As the former Deputy Chair of the House of Reps Economics Committee, it came out in testimony earlier this year, I think it was, that the Reserve Bank Reserve Fund had been depleted by the Labor Party as a special dividend asked for by the Treasurer as part of his desperation to try to have a surplus of some $500 million taken from the Reserve Bank Reserve Fund against the stated interests and expression of the Reserve Bank Governor. So what we're doing now is we're providing a grant of $8.8 billion back to the Reserve Bank to effectively top up the Reserve Bank, so it's about 15% of their assets at risk. And this is a consequence of two factors. The first is the appreciation of the Australian dollar. As we know, the Reserve Bank from time to time dips its toe in the water when it comes to the currency. But the other reason we're doing it is because Labor was sucking money directly from the Reserve Bank back up to try to prop up their budget bottom line.
Today the Reserve Bank issued its annual report, and in 2013 its accounting profit $4.3 billion for 2013. So explain to me how it needs.
Because they want the advice from the Reserve Bank Governor is that they would like to have around 15% of their assets at risk sitting in capital. That's the reason why. Right. Labor depleted this significantly over the past 6 years as part of their attempt to prop up their budget bottom line because they were spending like drunken sailors. And again, I reassert, against the express interests as were put forward by the Reserve Bank Governor. And so we're doing the responsible thing, and this is just another example of the Coalition repairing the damage that was left behind by Labor.
And I think also the uncertainty, about the global outlook, and I think it only makes sense to have a buffer there, a big buffer there. It's not about what profits they make or anything. You do need that leeway in case things go wrong, which none of us will know.
Global outlook absolutely matters, and what's been refreshing in the last couple of months is to hear Liberals actually notice that something happens beyond our own borders. I mean, for the last 6 years we've been hearing denial of the global financial crisis, and now we're seeing the need to have prudent economic management in case something happens.
Sure. Did you leave the Reserve Bank? The GFC?
Yeah, the GFC's over. You keep blaming the GFC. But what I love about what Steve said is that everything we're now hearing from the Liberals now is putting aside money for an international rainy day. But you've just said that the reason why you need to put money into the Reserve Bank is because of $500 million, $500 million.
That was this year alone.
Richard, I don't think it actually was this year. In terms of a dividend, in terms of a dividend, and you replaced it 16 times over, 17 times over, 17 times over.
I'm very happy to respond to that.
I'm very happy to respond.
What we're actually saying, they're acting on advice from the Reserve Bank.
Well, so there's a few things here, and I think this points to a deeper issue, David, about the way in which the Abbott government is going about its business. There is a culture of secrecy with this government. What we actually need to see, if there was advice, let's have a look at it, because this is a big call. $9 billion in a press release. It'd be nice to see what the advice was. If you're saying you need to lift the debt ceiling from 300 to 500, in circumstances where Joe Hockey was squealing every time we put it up by 50 billion, it'd be nice to see my EFO, but we don't get any of this information. And I actually think in the absence of that, it is reasonable to conclude that what we've actually got here is deficit padding. I mean, that's what's going on here. They are creating a big deficit now, which they'll blame on Labor as sure as night follows day. So the next year looks better.
Okay, why can't that advice from the Reserve Bank or request or whatever it was, why can't that be made public?
Well, look, from my perspective, these are questions that should be put to the Reserve Bank Governor. I mean, I can't speak on behalf of the Reserve Bank.
He doesn't often come on this show.
But what he does do is appear before the House of Representatives Economics Committee twice a year.
I'm sure you guys will be asking
Labor will have, you see, what's extraordinary.
But can you tell me this? Presumably you've seen it. Does he need the money this year, right now? It's not that he said, I need this money over some time.
The Reserve Bank has asked for a grant to be provided to them, which we are providing to them.
This year?
It is to improve. Well, whether it was this year,
The charge you just heard is that you are deficit padding, right? To make this year's budget look worse, next year's budget look better. Can you answer that charge?
Yeah, I'm very happy to answer that charge. Any day of the week, as a member of the coalition, I'm happy to have our track record held up against Labor's. The charge coming from Labor, the guys who said we'll deliver $1 billion surplus, stuffed around with company tax timing to try to prop it up, ripped $500 million from the Reserve Bank and actually delivered a $30 billion surplus. And then he turns around and says, you can't trust the coalition.
The question was, I just want to quickly get one answer to this. The question was, did the Reserve Bank Governor ask for the money this year?
And I've told you need to talk to the Reserve Bank Governor about that.
Why wouldn't the government give us
You will have the opportunity to put all these questions directly to the Reserve Bank.
We're missing a couple of good points, including some good news. The Reserve Bank made $4 billion in profit. It's one of the most profitable institutions in the country. I think the government's done the right thing in putting a bit more money into their reserves, but I think Richard's right, they're clearly padding up the deficit. Again, the $8 billion didn't vanish. It's gone from one account that the government owns to another account that the government owns. It's the Reserve Bank.
You see it on the budget bottom line.
No, but this is the point. Sometimes when we transfer money, for example, to the broadband network, we don't capture that. That's off budget. Sometimes when we transfer money to the Reserve Bank, we do capture it. Sometimes when we transfer money to the Future Fund, we do. Sometimes we don't. I mean, the fact is a lot of this, we get all excited about the budget deficit and, how big is it and what's the debt. There is a lot of accounting going on here. Let's be really clear. The Reserve Bank made $4 billion. We own it. That's a good day. We've just transferred $8 billion from one of our accounts to another one of our accounts. Nothing important here has happened.
It doesn't sound as though there's anything you need to do about the budget or the deficit.
No, that's entirely disingenuous.
You're pro more tax. You're opposed to any sort of debt ceiling.
No, I'm not.
Don't worry about the deficit.
These are government.
It's great living in a theoretical world.
No, it's not theoretical. You as the government of Australia own a consolidated revenue account and you own the Reserve Bank. You just moved money from one of your accounts to the other.
Well, if it was that straightforward, then I guess we could all just live in blissful ignorance, and the Reserve Bank could lose $20 billion a year, and we would never have to worry about it because it's just one account to another account.
You did the right thing.
I agreed with you.
You missed it. I agreed with you. You should have transferred the money. You should have transferred the money.
The point is that we are a government that is about responsibility, and we think it's important that different agencies take responsibility for outcomes and that we closely monitor the health of all of our agencies.
I agree with all of
that. The fact is that when it comes to Reserve Bank, and despite Richard saying, it was only $500 million, that was last financial year. Your government ripped millions out of the Reserve Bank on an ongoing basis.
That is not right. That is absolutely... And the coalition governments took dividends as well.
Yes,
when we could afford it.
Yes, there was also a little kind of thing called the GFC that came in between that. And the other issue, I think, in general, is that, you were saying about, what do people think about this? I think many people are giving the Liberal Party at the moment the benefit of the doubt. I think obviously Labor's record on economic management was not accepted by the majority of the public. So it may well be that the coalition really, really stuffs this up. But at the moment, in terms of the politics, I think they can get away with what they're doing as long as they sound as though they're being reasonable.
After the break, we're going to move beyond the budget. ACT passed gay marriage laws this week. Should they be overturned? And also, the bushfires. Has climate change played a role? Stay with us.
Mid-size escape.
How does it feel to know I've got the perfect home loan for me?
Know the feeling. Core Mortgage Choice.
Bad boys, what you gonna chew? What you gonna chew when they come for you? Bad boys, what you gonna chew? What you gonna chew when they come for you?
Chewing extra after eating and drinking helps keep teeth clean, fresh and healthy.
Bad boys. Bad boys, what you gonna chew? What you gonna chew when they come for you?
The stroke's made everything hard, but I mean, you cope, don't you?
My brain still works. It just doesn't connect to my mouth anymore.
We do have hope that he may walk again, but
I just want to communicate, to say sorry to Jen and the kids.
I know, love.
To tell anyone who'll listen, don't smoke.
Authorised by the New South Wales Government, Sydney.
Baby, you should know. I say it once, twice, I say it nice and slow, yeah. Hey, now listen up and listen real close, baby. It's the words in my mouth that matter the most. I won't.
With new bars, restaurants and entertainment, there's something new for every one of you at Crown.
It's more connected with Bluetooth hands-free and audio streaming across the range. And more safe with 7 airbags and ESC.
What took you so long?
Suzuki Swift from $14,990 drive away.
Welcome back to the program. We're talking tonight to Steve Ciobo, Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer, Richard Dennis, the Executive Director of the Australia Institute, Jennifer Hewett, National Affairs columnist with the Australian Financial Review, and the Shadow Immigration Minister, Richard Marles. A few other issues I want to touch on tonight. The ACT Assembly this week passed gay marriage laws. The federal government has acted swiftly, lodging a writ of summons in the High Court to overturn or to challenge the validity of these laws, whether they do fit with the Commonwealth Marriage Act. Steve Ciobo, first to you. Would you like to see these laws overturned?
Look, I think there's something to be said about certainty. I mean, the reality is, and I'm digging back to many years ago when I was in law school, but I think it's Section 104 of the Constitution that says that if the federal government covers the field, then you know, subsequent laws, well, not subsequent, but laws, state government or whatever have to respect that. Here you've got a territory law, so you know, the Commonwealth clearly under the Marriage Act has made a declaration under the Marriage Act about what the law is, and so if there's inconsistency, I do believe it's important that those constitutional principles are upheld.
So this is a constitutional issue for you, more
this
so
is
than
not a moral issue.
Right.
I mean, and I know that there have been some who unfortunately have tried to portray it as a moral issue, but make no mistake, it's a clear issue about what uncertainty can be caused as a consequence of inconsistent laws at a federal level and at a state level.
So this is now a decision for the High Court. What's your view on gay marriage, though?
Well, look, I've said for a long time, and I'm on the public record, that I support gay civil unions. I personally don't support gay marriage. So I'm on the public record with that.
Richard Marles?
Well, I think this is really a diversionary tactic on the part of the government. Whatever ultimately happens with this court case, fundamentally, this is a question which should be dealt with in the parliaments. It is a moral issue, and my position on this has been well known. I support gay marriage, but what we need to see is, at the end of the day, conscience allowed to be applied in the Parliament of Australia on both sides of the aisle, including on the Conservative side of the aisle.
Okay,
and this avoids them having to deal with that question.
To that end, should this be a decision of the federal Parliament, not the High Court?
Well, I think ultimately this is an issue which ought to be determined in the Parliament, and so I think what's going on here is Tony Abbott doing everything he can to avoid the very difficult issue of this coming to the Parliament and he having to allow his party room a conscience vote, as he should, because he doesn't want to do that.
What an extraordinary comment. I mean, this was brought on by the Labor Party in the ACT. I mean, how do you possibly suggest that this is some kind of distraction implemented by the coalition when it was the Labor Party in the ACT Assembly who brought this on?
Because the decision to take this to the High Court was a decision of your government.
Oh, so we shouldn't worry about inconsistency between state and territory laws and federal laws. Just let that go.
What you're doing is running down that path as fast as you can to try and avoid this ending up in the Parliament, so that you do not have to deal with the issue of there being a conscience vote on your side of the House.
People can see straight through this line, Richard, with due respect,
I think people can see straight through taking it to the High Court.
I think you're treating people as mugs. This is about inconsistency in laws between state/territory governments and the federal government.
This is about gay marriage.
Plain as the nose on your face.
All right. I want to move on to a few other issues as well. The bushfires, which have been devastating in parts of New South Wales for the last week. The fairly predictable debate about whether climate change has played a role or not. Richard Dennis, is there any evidence that climate change contributed to these fires?
Well, let's be clear, climate change doesn't start bushfires, but what the science tells us is that climate change makes bushfires more intense.
But is there any evidence that they've made these fires more intense?
Well, if it's hotter and drier than people expected, that's exactly the kind of thing climate change is going to drive. Now, you know, it might be nice in politics to be able to apportion blame. The reality is what climate change science tells us is we're going to have more of them, they're going to be bigger. Well, what we've just seen is big ones a lot earlier than we've seen them before.
Well, not really. In New South Wales, and I went through some of the stats today, in September, October, November, spring months, there have often been pretty bad fires.
Oh, indeed, and there can be bad fires in winter, you know, but the fact is October is an unusual early start to the bushfire season, and again, that's what the climate science predicts over time. Did climate change start the bushfires? Of course it didn't. But then there's this broader point of, is it politicising climate change to talk about it when there's fires? Well, my recollection is we talked about asylum seeker policy when people were dead in the ocean off Christmas Island. My recollection is people talk about gun law reform after somebody shoots 20 people in the US. So I just think it's a cheap shot to suggest that people who are concerned about climate change shouldn't talk about climate change when you're in the middle of the kind of event that all the science says is more likely.
I tend to agree with you when you put it like that, but when Adam Bandt, the Greens deputy leader, said that Tony Abbott's policies are going to create more of these events, isn't he capitalising on the suffering that we're seeing to make a political point?
Well, my point is that's the way modern politics appears to be played. You know, the media are more interested. Oh, well, personally, I think the issue is what greenhouse gas emission targets are we setting? And both parties share a very timid approach with 5% emission reduction targets. So I'm actually more concerned as an economist about the targets we set. If we want to waste billions of dollars on submarines, that's a pity. And if we want to spend more than we need to tackling climate change, then so be it. What actually affects what's going to affect the climate in the long run is not carbon price or direct action. What's going to affect the climate is how many emissions we put into the atmosphere.
Jennifer Hewett, we know when there was a very long drought, the Howard government did step up its efforts on climate change. These sort of natural events can influence the public mood on climate change. Do you think we are seeing more of these sorts of events, and do you think they are going to have an impact on the public attitude towards tackling climate change?
Well, I think it does have an effect on the public mood if there's, you know, an obvious link, or people think there is an obvious link. In fact, you know, I think it's very obvious that Australia's had very severe bushfires over many decades, and that there is you know, this whole debate about whether or not climate change is going to make things more intense is very nebulous, really, and maybe that'll prove the case. But the idea that we're going to link these bushfires to the idea of a debate on carbon tax or otherwise in Australia is ludicrous. I mean, it wouldn't matter what Australia did at all, you know, in terms of having any effect on these bushfires. So I do think that is kind of absurd, and that's where I think the real politicisation kind of comes in, and I don't think people appreciate that.
Richard Marles?
I think there is an issue about the sensitivity of when to have a debate, and I suppose why it's a bit different to what you've described earlier is because this is an ongoing event. There is, in a sense, public policy or public administration involved in the whole emergency response. It takes time to sort it out. I think I totally understand a firefighter in the field where this is playing out over days and sometimes weeks wanting to focus on that before we have the debate. And, you know, we seem to be just getting to the end of it. So I do think that it's not unreasonable to be sensitive to those people who are fighting the fires and to focus on that right now. I think that's an important point to make. It is obviously a debate which needs to happen. I don't think it is reasonable for the Prime Minister to describe Christiana Figueres, if I've pronounced it right, as speaking through her hat. I think that's really disrespectful to somebody who is obviously an expert, and specifically in her comments made the point that you can't link any particular event to climate change. That's not how climate change science works. Climate change science is about saying that you will see more of particular events rather than a particular event being linked to climate change. And the risk, of course, for those, I mean, there's no question climate change is happening, but the risk in linking a particular event is, of course, when the event doesn't happen and when it starts to rain again or it gets cold, you say, oh, well, it's all sorted now, and that's not the case either. So I think it's an important debate to have. I don't think the Prime Minister's intervention was particularly helpful. I think it is right to be a bit sensitive to what's going on with fighting the fires, and let's get that done first.
Steve Ciobo, is it possible in your mind that this series of fires that we've seen could have something to do with climate change or not?
Well, look, I agree with Richard in terms of his introductory comments, David. I mean, this is ongoing. We've got people, 200 homes that have been lost. We had, unfortunately, a firefighter who lost his life today.
Well, the pilot,
well, I mean, supporting the effort. And, you know, I do think that there's a right time and a right place. And personally, I don't believe this is the right time to have this discussion. The reality is that across the political aisle, we all agree that climate change is happening. We all agree that there is a man-made contribution to that. I mean, Tony Abbott has said it, Labor leaders have said it. Where we disagree is the pathway we take to reach the destination. In this particular case, it's a 5% reduction in CO2 emissions. But I think that, unfortunately, there's been a little bit of hot-headedness by some people to weigh in on this debate at the wrong time.
Look, I do want to discuss one final issue tonight, and that's asylum seekers. The Immigration Minister, Scott Morrison, this week, it was revealed, directed government officials to refer to asylum seekers as illegal maritime arrivals. Well, it has prompted the question, what have they done that is illegal? Steve Ciobo?
Well, they've come into Australia illegally. That's what they've done. And this isn't a phrase that we've invented. It's contained in the United Nations protocol against people smuggling. Article 3, I think it is, David, that makes it very clear that if you come into a country without a valid visa, that is illegal. Now, that's a different question to whether you can claim asylum seeker status or be an asylum seeker. But make no mistake about it, it is an illegal entry into the country. You've come without a valid visa, and that's the reason why we make the comment.
Is it?
Well, we can have a debate about whether or not people are being illegal or not. I mean, when
but
people...
it sounds pretty clear-cut based on that reference.
What did I say that's wrong?
Oh, well, OK, if you're fleeing Somalia into Kenya, you're not going to have a visa, and yet it is completely legal to seek asylum. So
Your arrival in Australia without a visa, is that illegal, yes or no? It's a very straightforward question.
It is not illegal to seek asylum.
It's not illegal. See, but you're not... This is the point, though.
But
deliberately blurring the water.
The point is...
But Richard, you're the shadow immigration spokesman.
It is not illegal to seek asylum.
So don't blur it. Is it illegal to come into Australia without a visa?
It is
yes
not,
or no?
It is not illegal to seek asylum, and it's not illegal to seek asylum in Australia. But here's my point.
This is the politics that you're going to play.
No, it's the politics that the government is playing, because the government is the ones who have gone out and changed things here. So why would they change the language here? And what this is about is trying to demonise people who are on boats for domestic political purposes. But I guess my point here is this, David. They're pretty good at changing language in relation to that. They're pretty good at coming up with crazy ideas about buying boats in Indonesia and wagging their finger at the Indonesian government. But when it comes to the integrity of the PNG arrangement, which is the one thing which has been stopping boat arrivals to date, already, within a couple of months, they are in the business of undermining that. Already they have made it clear that there will be people since the date in July coming to the Christmas Island who will stay there indefinitely and not go to PNG. So on all the bells and whistles, on calling it Operation Sovereign Borders, on all of that stuff, big talking, but when it comes to the substance, they are undermining the integrity. No question that that's the case. They are undermining the integrity of the PNG arrangement.
Has this decision been taken, or is this just speculation?
I got to be honest with you, David. I have trouble taking Richard seriously. I mean, for goodness sake, this is coming from the Labor Party, who saw an influx of some 50,000 people who completely thwarted efforts to have any sort of border sovereignty. And now you're saying, oh, the problem with the coalition is that they're watering down our tough laws.
But you are, and this is the position you present.
Let's just get back to what we're talking about. Has this happened or not? Are families not going to be sent to Nauru now?
There will be a whole range of different choices that are made, not choices, sorry, outcomes that are achieved as a consequence of us trying to control the legacy we we've been left with Labor.
But the bedrock policy was you come by boat to Australia, you will not stay here. You'll go to Manus Island. Does that remain the fundamental basis of the policy?
Well, that will be determined by a whole range of factors, including capacity at various ports.
Right.
I mean, the reality is this, that we are going to be reinstated.
That's the watering down right there. That's the watering down.
You guys argued there wasn't a capacity issue. There wasn't a capacity issue at Manus. You could keep expanding things there.
Exactly. And that was
It obviously takes some time to do that, even if you're going to do that.
Yes, but that was but here's the thing. I mean, this is a government with learner plates on, and that's the reality here.
Well,
so the first thing of substance they did was they said they'd turn it around in 48 hours. This has created a glut. This is really what's going on. This has created a glut in Manus, and so they don't have capacity. And so now they're in a position of having to hold people indefinitely.
You just said that we can keep expanding capacity like that.
Didn't say that. You can expand capacity, but it does take time. But that's why you've got to flow people through in a measured way, and that's why saying that you would turn people around in 48 hours was precipitous, and it's led you to a position where you've now put Australia back on the table and saying there are going to be people who will indefinitely stay across this island.
I am very happy in 6 months' time to look back at the track record of this government compared to yours when it comes to dealing with
boat arrivals have stopped.
The avalanche of people.
Boat arrivals have slowed down since the PNG arrangement. No boats been bought, no boats been turned back.
Whatever you're actually doing, we have seen a significant slowdown in boat arrivals in the last couple of months. Well, you'll say because of what you'll say.
But they haven't done anything.
Jennifer Hewett,
they changed the language.
His credit shared here. Can we finish on
I think the PNG decision taken by the Labor Party has had an effect, but so has the negotiations that have been going on with the Indonesians by the Abbott government, and they've actually been far more successful than the Labor Party said they would be, that they could possibly be. And they have led to very quiet negotiations rather than the usual kind of fights, and the fact that the Indonesians have, for example, accepted some people back on the boats, the things that was, again, the Labor Party said would be impossible in the last couple of weeks. And I do think that there is a clear commitment now from the Indonesian president to have a bilateral relationship and to have bilateral negotiations on this, and to, rather than have it all as multinational. I think that's been a great success.
Richard?
Well, I'd like to come back to your actual question, David, about why we're calling them illegals, and that's because it's all about making sure the public sees them in the wrong or right way. I mean, back in 2001 with Natasha Stott-Despoja, I went to Woomera where people were sewing their lips together, and we've been keeping the media away from the human tragedy of asylum seekers since Tampa. We don't talk to them, we don't ask them where they're fleeing from, we don't ask them what they've gone through, and we call them names. So let's be clear, the reason it's so important that the terminology change is to make sure the public never thinks about the people. We don't want their human story out there, and calling them illegal.
What is the reason behind the terminology change?
You know what really bugs me as someone on the centre right? What really bugs me is when people on the centre left take this moral high ground and claim that they're so concerned with asylum seekers and how their position is so much morally superior than the position that we've taken. And yet that same policy thinking has led to an influx of 50,000 people, saw over 1,000 people die at sea.
Okay, but the question
let's be clear, I didn't make a position then. I said, can we talk to them?
We've only got 30 seconds. Why has the terminology changed?
The terminology hasn't changed. What we have said is that if they arrive by sea, they are an illegal, without a valid visa, they are a legal maritime arrival. And that is a statement because you changed the terminology to begin with. And we are just stating an obvious statement of fact. If you come without a visa, you've arrived illegally, full stop.
Full stop. We're out of time. Steve Ciobo, Richard Dennis, Jennifer Hewett, Richard Marles. Good to talk to all of you this week. Thanks for your company as well. We'll see you same time next week. Bye for now.